I remember the exact moment my world shattered. The dining room was silent except for the clinking of my father's fork against his plate. The air was thick with tension, a kind I had never felt before. My mother sat across from me, her fingers tightening around the crystal wine glass, her lips pressed into a thin, unforgiving line. My father, a man who had built an empire from nothing, cleared his throat and set his utensils down with a deliberate slowness that made my stomach knot. Then came the words that changed everything. "If you go through with this, Emily, you are no longer our daughter." The weight of his voice slammed into me harder than I ever thought possible. My breath hitched, and I felt Ryan stiffen beside me, his hand instinctively reaching for mine under the table. I had known this conversation wouldn't be easy. I had expected anger, disappointment, maybe even the silent treatment for a while. But this? This was a death sentence. A complete and utter erasure of my existence from their lives. I swallowed hard, my fingers tightening around Ryan's. "Dad, please. This isn't." He raised a hand, silencing me. His gaze, cold as steel, bore into mine. "You've made your choice. Now live with it." I turned to my mother, silently begging for some form of kindness, for a flicker of the woman who had once cradled me in her arms when I was sick, who had brushed my hair every night before bed. But there was nothing in her eyes except contempt. "You don't understand what you're doing," she said, her voice sharp but eerily controlled. "That man, he will ruin you." Ryan's jaw clenched, but he stayed quiet. He had promised me he wouldn't fight back, no matter what they said. He knew this wasn't about him. It was about control. About power. About my father refusing to accept that I was more than just a chess piece in his game. I forced myself to stand, even though my legs felt weak beneath me. "I love him," I said, my voice trembling but firm. "And if you can't accept that, then I have nothing left to say." For a second, just a second, I thought I saw hesitation in my father's expression. A flicker of doubt, a brief moment of weakness. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by an unwavering resolve. He reached into his suit jacket and pulled out a folder. With a cold, calculated movement, he slid it across the table toward me. I hesitated before picking it up. The moment my eyes scanned the contents, my breath caught in my throat. It was a legal document. A formal, binding declaration that I was being disowned. Every account under my name was being frozen. My trust fund, gone. My shares in the company, revoked. My name, removed from every family record, as if I had never existed. I felt the blood drain from my face. "You," my voice cracked. "You planned this." My father leaned back in his chair, expression unreadable. "Actions have consequences, Emily." I looked at my mother again, one last desperate attempt to find something, anything, human in her. But she simply lifted her glass and took a slow, deliberate sip of wine, as if none of this affected her. I felt something inside me break. The little girl who had spent her entire life trying to make them proud, to live up to their expectations, to be the perfect daughter, she died that night. A bitter laugh bubbled up in my throat, but I swallowed it down. Without another word, I placed the folder back on the table. "Then I guess this is goodbye." I turned and walked away, Ryan right beside me. As we stepped out of that house, the house I had once called home, I expected to feel grief, loss, devastation. Instead, all I felt was emptiness. The night air was cold as we reached the car, but I barely noticed. My hands were shaking, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. Ryan opened the passenger door for me, but I didn't move. "Emily," he said softly, his voice full of concern. "Say something." I turned to him, my vision blurry with unshed tears. "They never loved me," I whispered. Ryan cupped my face in his hands. "That's not true." I let out a shaky breath, forcing myself to believe him. To believe that love wasn't just something that came with conditions and ultimatums. As he wrapped his arms around me, I made a silent promise to myself. I would never, ever crawl back to them. And one day, they would regret throwing me away. Ryan drove in silence. The city lights flickered past the window, blurring into streaks of gold and red. I pressed my forehead against the glass, my breath fogging the surface. My father's words echoed in my head, sharp, final, irreversible. You are no longer our daughter. I squeezed my eyes shut, but the weight in my chest refused to lift. The pain wasn't just emotional, it was physical, a crushing force that made my ribs feel like they were caving in. I wanted to scream, to cry, to demand answers that I already knew I'd never get. They had erased me. Ryan's hand reached for mine, his fingers warm, steady. Emily, he said softly. We'll figure this out. I turned to him, my voice hollow. We have nothing, Ryan. His grip tightened. We have each other. It should have been comforting. It should have been enough. But all I could think about was the world I had just been cast out of, the life I had been raised in, the security I had never questioned. My parents' fortune had built a safety net so thick, I had never once felt what it was like to fall. Tonight, that net had been cut. And I was plummeting. The apartment Ryan had rented was small, too small. It smelled of fresh paint and dust, the walls bare, the furniture sparse. A single flickering bulb hung in the kitchen, casting a dull glow over the countertops. I dropped my bag by the door and stood in the center of the room, staring at the cracks in the ceiling. This was real. This was my life now. Ryan wrapped his arms around me from behind, pressing a soft kiss to my temple. I know this isn't what you're used to. I swallowed the lump in my throat. I don't care about that. He turned me to face him. Then what is it? I hesitated, my voice barely above a whisper. I don't know who I am without them. It was the truth. My identity had always been tied to the Carter name, to my father's empire, to the privileges that came with being their daughter. Without them, I felt unmoored, like a ship without an anchor. Ryan cupped my face, forcing me to meet his gaze. Then let's find out. I woke up the next morning to the sound of Ryan typing away at his laptop. He was sitting at the tiny dining table, papers spread out in front of him, a deep crease between his brows. I pulled on one of his hoodies and shuffled toward him. You didn't sleep, did you? He gave me a tired smile. Had too much work to do. I glanced at the papers, business plans, investor notes, projections. Ryan had been working on his startup for months, trying to build something from the ground up. I had always admired his determination, his refusal to let obstacles slow him down. I pulled out a chair and sat beside him. Let me help. He raised an eyebrow. You don't have to. I need to, I interrupted. I need to do something. I can't just sit here and let my life crumble. He hesitated, then nodded. All right. And just like that, we got to work. The next few months were brutal. Without my father's connections, we had to fight for every opportunity. We pitched investors, only to be met with rejection. We worked 16-hour days, barely scraping by. There were nights when we went to bed hungry, too broke to afford anything but cheap takeout. There were moments when I wanted to break, when the weight of everything felt unbearable. But every time doubt crept in, I reminded myself of one thing: I would never go back. I refused to let them be right. So I pushed harder. I studied business strategies late into the night, analyzing competitors, refining our approach. I networked relentlessly, cold calling people who wanted nothing to do with me. I knocked on doors that refused to open. And then, finally, one did. A mid-level investor took a chance on us, injecting just enough capital to give us room to breathe. It wasn't a miracle, it wasn't enough to make us rich overnight, but it was a start. I remember sitting in that tiny apartment after signing the contract, staring at the papers in my hands. Ryan grinned, exhaustion and pride in his eyes. We did it. I exhaled, a slow, shaky breath. No. We started. Because I knew one thing for certain, this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. The ink on our first investor contract had barely dried when the first whispers of Carter Enterprises' downfall began. At first, it was subtle, just a few murmurs in financial circles, a couple of speculative news articles questioning recent decisions made by my father's board. I didn't pay much attention. I was too busy trying to build something of my own, too focused on proving that I could succeed without them. But then the murmurs turned into headlines. Carter Enterprises faces lawsuits over shady business deals. Stock prices plummet as investors pull out of Carter Empire. CEO Henry Carter under fire for alleged mismanagement. The empire my father had spent his life building, the one he had chosen over his own daughter, was cracking at the foundation. And the world was watching it crumble. Ryan was the one who showed me the first major report. We were in our apartment, the same one that had felt suffocating when we first moved in but now carried the weight of our hard-earned progress. He slid his laptop across the table, his expression unreadable. Emily, you need to see this. I hesitated before looking at the screen. The article was brutal. Carter Enterprises had lost millions in a failed real estate venture. Several investors had pulled out, and my father's biggest project had just been shut down due to a legal dispute. I scanned the article, my pulse quickening with every word. They're losing everything, I murmured. Ryan leaned back, watching me carefully. How do you feel about that? I opened my mouth, then closed it. How did I feel? Satisfied? Angry? Relieved? None of those emotions fit. Instead, there was something deeper, something heavier. Vindication. I had spent months pulling myself out of the wreckage they had left me in. And now, while I was rising, they were falling. I exhaled slowly, my fingers tracing the edge of the laptop. They did this to themselves. Ryan nodded. Yeah. They did. The damage didn't stop there. Over the next few weeks, Carter Enterprises spiraled further out of control. Every morning, new headlines appeared, each one more damning than the last. Carter family faces internal power struggles as board members rebel. Former investors sue Carter Enterprises for fraud. Henry Carter's business legacy at risk. Will the empire survive? For years, my father had controlled every aspect of his company with an iron grip, refusing to let anyone challenge his authority. But now, the board was turning on him. His once loyal allies were jumping ship, trying to distance themselves from the disaster he had created. I watched it all unfold from a distance, sipping my coffee each morning as I skimmed the latest articles. It was surreal, seeing my father, the man who had once held so much power over my life, being dragged through the mud by the same business world he had ruled for decades. And then, one evening, I got the call. I was at my office, in the sleek new building Ryan and I had just moved into. Our company was still growing, but we had made it. We had investors, employees, a future. My phone buzzed. An unknown number. I hesitated before answering. Hello? A beat of silence. Then, Emily. I froze. I hadn't heard my father's voice in nearly 2 years, but I recognized it instantly. Deep. Controlled. But weaker than I remembered. I felt my chest tighten. What do you want? A sigh crackled through the line. I need to see you. I almost laughed. Now he wanted to see me? After disowning me? After throwing me away like I was nothing? I leaned back in my chair, gripping the phone tightly. Why? His voice dropped lower. We need to talk. It's important. I could hear it in his tone, desperation. He wasn't calling as my father. He was calling as a man who had lost everything. And for the first time in my life, I held the power. That night, I stood outside the restaurant where we had agreed to meet. It was one of the Carter family's usual spots, an upscale place with valet parking and dim lighting. I almost laughed at the irony. 2 years ago, I wouldn't have been able to step foot here without my parents' approval. Now, I walked in as an outsider by my own choice. When I spotted him, I barely recognized him. My father had aged. His suit, once pristine and commanding, looked slightly wrinkled. His posture was tense, his fingers drumming against the table in an anxious rhythm. And his eyes, those sharp, calculating eyes that had once looked at me with disappointment, now held something I had never seen before. Defeat. I sat down across from him, folding my hands in my lap. I didn't speak first. I let him sweat. Finally, he cleared his throat. "Emily, thank you for coming." I tilted my head slightly. I was curious. That's all. He inhaled sharply, as if bracing himself. "I need your help." 3 words. 3 words that shattered the last remnants of the power he had once held over me. I let the silence stretch between us before speaking. "Help with what?" He hesitated. Then, with visible effort, he said it. "Carter Enterprises is in trouble. I need an investor." I stared at him, expression unreadable. And in that moment, I realized something. I wasn't his daughter anymore. I was his last chance. And I had no intention of saving him. I stared at my father across the table, his once powerful presence reduced to nothing more than a desperate man grasping at his last straw. The weight of his request settled between us like a thick fog. He needed me. For years, I had imagined this moment. I had dreamed of the day my father, the man who had turned his back on me without hesitation, would have to crawl back and acknowledge that I was more than just his discarded daughter. But now that it was happening, I felt nothing. No joy. No satisfaction. Just a quiet, unsettling calm. I tilted my head, feigning curiosity. "So, let me get this straight," I said, my voice steady. "You want me, the daughter you disowned, to invest in the company you chose over me?" My father flinched, but he quickly masked it with that same hardened expression I had grown up fearing. "Emily, this isn't about the past. It's about business." I let out a soft, humorless laugh. "Is that what you told yourself when you signed the papers to erase me from your life?" His jaw clenched, the muscles in his face twitching. For a moment, he didn't answer. Then, with visible effort, he swallowed his pride. "I made mistakes," he admitted, his voice tight. "But I am still your father. And Carter Enterprises is still your family's legacy." My stomach twisted at the audacity of his words. Family's legacy. He had thrown me out without hesitation, but now that his empire was falling, he wanted to pretend that bond still existed. I leaned forward, lowering my voice. "You had a daughter who would have done anything for you. Who would have carried on your legacy with pride. But you made it clear, I was never enough for you." His fingers curled into a fist on the table. "You don't understand what it was like for me. I built that company from the ground up. I had to make tough decisions." "Tough decisions?" I repeated, narrowing my eyes. "You didn't just cut me off financially. You cut me out of your life. You let me struggle, let me wonder if I would ever be good enough. And now you want my help?" The silence that followed was suffocating. Finally, he exhaled, his shoulders sagging slightly. "I don't expect forgiveness. I just need a way to fix this mess." There it was. The final admission of defeat. I took my time sipping my drink, watching him. My father was not a man who begged. He was not a man who accepted failure. And yet, here he was, powerless before the very person he had abandoned. I could have walked away. I could have left him to drown in the wreckage of his own arrogance. But I had a better idea. You want my help? I asked, setting my glass down. Fine. But there will be conditions. His gaze snapped to mine, eyes filled with cautious hope. Anything. I let a slow smile spread across my lips. First, you resign. The color drained from his face. Excuse me? I leaned back in my chair, crossing my legs. I won't invest a single dollar in Carter Enterprises unless you step down as CEO. His fists clenched against the table. I built that company. And now you're destroying it. I met his gaze evenly. It's time for someone more capable to take over. He stared at me, his breathing uneven. For the first time, I saw true fear in his expression. Not fear of losing the company, fear of losing control. I let the silence stretch before delivering the final blow. Second condition, I take full control of the company. Every decision runs through me. No exceptions. My father looked like he had been punched in the gut. You can't be serious. Oh, I'm completely serious. I leaned forward. You don't get to walk back into my life and expect things to go your way. You need me. That means I make the rules. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for his glass. He took a slow sip, his mind undoubtedly racing through every possible way to escape this nightmare. But there was no escape. He was trapped in the very corner he had once shoved me into. Finally, he set his glass down and exhaled sharply. Fine. It was just one word, but it carried the weight of years of power shifting hands. Fine? I echoed, tilting my head. You'll step down? He hesitated, then nodded stiffly. Yes. A slow, satisfied smile tugged at the corner of my lips. Good. Then we'll have the contracts drawn up tomorrow. My father didn't speak as I stood up. He simply sat there, staring into his glass, a man who had lost everything, including his pride. I turned to leave, but before I walked away, I paused and looked back at him. You once told me actions have consequences, I said softly. I guess you were right. And with that, I walked out of the restaurant, leaving the past behind me, and taking my father's empire with me. As I stepped out of the restaurant, the night air felt different, cooler, lighter, freer. The weight I had carried for years, the burden of proving my worth to a man who never saw it, had finally lifted. For the first time in my life, I wasn't the one being left behind. I was the one walking away. Ryan was waiting outside by the car, leaning against the hood with his arms crossed. He watched me closely as I approached, searching my face for an answer. How'd it go? I exhaled, letting the moment settle. He agreed. Ryan raised an eyebrow. He's really stepping down? I nodded, still half in disbelief. Not without a fight. But yeah. It's done. A slow smile spread across Ryan's face. So, what now? I looked up at the towering skyline, the city lights blinking like scattered stars. Carter Enterprises, my company now, stood among them. A place that once belonged to my father, now fully under my control. The irony wasn't lost on me. Now, I said, turning back to Ryan, we build something better. The transition wasn't smooth. The board fought me. Some loyalists still clung to the idea of my father's leadership, whispering doubts behind closed doors. They expected me to be weak, to be nothing more than a placeholder until someone more experienced took over. I proved them wrong. Within months, I began reshaping Carter Enterprises from the inside out. No more backdoor deals. No more empty partnerships built on greed. I brought in fresh talent, people who weren't tied to my father's past mistakes. The company, once crumbling under the weight of corruption, began to stabilize. And my father? He disappeared from the public eye. He still held shares, but his influence was gone. He had no power here anymore. Once, that realization would have left me conflicted. Now, it felt like justice. One afternoon, as I sat in my new office, the one that used to belong to my father, my phone rang. I didn't recognize the number, but I answered anyway. A familiar voice greeted me. Emily. I leaned back in my chair, staring out at the skyline. Mother. She hesitated. It's been a while. I let out a short, dry laugh. Yeah. It has. Another pause. Your father told me about the deal. Did he? I asked, keeping my voice even. He's struggling, she said, and for the first time, I heard something unexpected in her voice. Not pity. Not disappointment. Something closer to regret. He did this to himself, I replied. You both did. She sighed. I know. The words caught me off guard. I had spent years imagining this conversation, expecting her to defend him, to justify their choices. But she didn't. I made mistakes too, she admitted. I let him push you away. I should have stopped him. A strange emotion twisted in my chest. I wanted to tell her it was too late. That her guilt didn't erase the pain. But instead, I asked, why are you calling me? She hesitated. I just wanted to hear your voice. For the first time in years, she sounded human. Not the cold, distant woman who had watched me walk out of their lives without a word. I closed my eyes, my grip tightening on the phone. I don't know if I can forgive you. She didn't argue. I understand. The line went quiet for a moment. Then, before I could hang up, she said, I'm proud of you. Tears burned at the back of my eyes, but I didn't let them fall. I have to go. She didn't stop me. And this time, I was the one to end the call. That night, I sat on the balcony of our apartment, the city stretching out before me. Ryan joined me, handing me a glass of wine before settling into the chair beside me. To new beginnings, he said, raising his glass. I smiled, tapping mine against his. To never looking back. As I took a sip, I realized something. Revenge hadn't been the goal. Power wasn't the answer. The real victory had been learning that I didn't need their love to be whole. I had built something for myself. I had found happiness in my own way. And I was finally free.